It sounds like that's a big thing for you, like the problem of evil. You've talked about the problem of suffering.
If somebody goes through some negative experiences, but gets something good out of it and says, well, I'm glad that I went through that because of the good thing I got. If they were offered the opportunity, if you're a Christian, that's what I think faith is, by the way. Faith is not belief without evidence.
Ruslan.
You said in your video with Chris Williamson that you think if we were to time travel in the future, or if people 200 years from now, they'll be able to figure out why fine-tuning of the universe exists, but we still won't have an answer for the problem of evil.
Oh, sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
I think that's likely.
Yeah. So a bit about my story, you probably don't know much about me. Like, originally a refugee from Baku, me and my family fled because of persecution against Armenians. We come to America, all kinds of religious persecution, trauma, things that I remember, Soviet Union, communism, then to coming to America, my mom and my dad splitting, my mom spiraling, being an alcoholic for 5 years, me being in a Armenian apostolic church where I was sexually assaulted by some of the older altar boys, hating God, hating the church, and the problem of evil was my reason why I was no longer a believer. At the age of 11, I got arrested. Just a pretty rough childhood, and that was the thing that kept me from coming to Jesus, was like, there is no God, and if there is a God, he definitely doesn't like me or want anything to do with me, right? And so I had to sort through this as like, really the very first thing in my faith journey, right? We didn't grow up going to church in Baku because we were under the Soviet Union and communism. And then when we came to church here, I get sexually assaulted by the older altar boys when I was like 7 or 8. And then the church remarried my dad, and my mom claims that they were still together. So there's a lot of hostility towards the church, a lot of hostility towards God, a lot of hostility towards the problem of evil, a lot of personal issues that I had as a kid. And I had to sort through this. And so for me, I've seen it up close and personal. I've seen evil. I've seen some really dark things. And I've done some really dark things in my life when I was a kid, And so there's the theodicies that explain away the problem of evil. And if I'm being honest, Alex, I don't want anybody to go through what I had to go through as a kid. I don't want anybody to grow up in that sort of environment. I have a kid now, he's 10 years old, and the complete trajectory for his life is so much different than what I experienced at 10 years old, right? And I got a 4-year-old, and her life is so much different. Yet, despite all of that, I wouldn't have changed a thing about my life. Despite all of the bad things that happened, the bad things that happened led me to where I am today, right? And I'm happy in a weird way that, like, within God's providence, it's not that God caused those things to happen, but for whatever reason, I hold to Romans 8:28, that all things work for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And so as you've kind of said that, it sounds like that's your biggest, I don't want to speak for you, but it sounds like that's a big thing for you, like the problem of evil, specifically you've talked about the problem of suffering, of animals. Have you ever really sat with the theodicies around this stuff? Have you ever really considered the idea that God does work all things for good, that we can make sense of evil, that though bad things do happen to good people, that there is a reason we may not know on this side of eternity, versus just kind of thinking it's just kind of chaotic and random, and a God should stop it if a God does exist? Like, have you ever really sat with the theodicies and engaged with those? And again, I don't know anything about your childhood or your upbringing. Perhaps you've endured some evil things as well, which has kind of caused you to wrestle with this as well. So that's kind of my question for you, specifically about the problem of evil, because, man, I think there's purpose to pain. I think suffering makes us stronger, and I think there's a beauty to going through it that, again, though God is not endorsing it, but he does allow it. Thoughts on any of that?
Well, yeah, of course I have thought about this, and I'm familiar with at least all of the popular theodicies that people like to put forward. The problem is that once you use the word theodicy, which is a kind of technical philosophical term, you reduce an experience like the one you've just articulated to a syllogism on a page, which feels conversationally inappropriate. Like,
Sure.
The first thing to note is that this is like a different kind of conversation. But since you asked me to do it, like the kind of theodicy that you're alluding to there is a kind of instrumental view of what suffering is for. It leads to something that is worth having either for its own sake or worth having more than not having the suffering. So,
well said.
the problem that I have with this view, and I don't like to attach it to anybody's personal experiences because it's up to them to decide how they view their past. But in principle, if somebody goes through some negative experiences but gets something good out of it.
I have a massive update for you. I'm sure by this point, you've heard about the Blessed God Summit happening March 27th, 28th, 29th here in beautiful Carlsbad, California. But we've heard your requests. We've conceded to your demand. There are virtual tickets that are now available for the Blessed God Summit, so you can access it from anywhere in the world, as well as access to the replays. And for those of you guys that are looking for something extra, we're also offering a virtual ticket and an exclusive Bless God Summit merch bundle. There's some amazing art and some exclusive pieces done by our friend Josh Nadeau from Sword and Pencil that you have to check out. So join us online for the virtual event and experience some sessions from my favorite podcasters, pastors, and performers. We have a stacked lineup. I'm talking about Preston Perry, Dr. Sean McDowell, Inspiring Philosophy. What do you mean? Lila Rose, Alan Parr and his wife Jen Parr. We even have Nate Sala from Wise Disciple, Gavin Ortland, David Wood, Avery from God Logic Apologetics. And on the pastoral side, we have my friend Daniel Golding, Pastor Ed Newton from CBC in San Antonio, and my personal pastor from Rhythm Church, Pastor Jeff Moores and his wife Erin Moores. You won't want to miss out from amazing performances from America's Got Talent winner Dustin Savella, Billboard charting hip-hop artist John Keith and Miles Minnick. And we're still finalizing a few more speakers. So head over to blessgod.shop, get your virtual ticket now, and you can get yourself a bundle with some of the exclusive merch as well. I'll see you over there, all right? Peace.
And says, well, I'm glad that I went through that because of the good thing I got. If they were offered the opportunity for their children, say, firstly, like whether you would want your children to go through the same experience, it's given that at the end of it, you think you're glad that you had it and you wouldn't change a thing, whether you want to put your children to do the same thing. Now imagine that you could give your children the good stuff that you got out of it without giving them the bad stuff. Then I think it would be the case that if you still gave them the bad stuff, it would be an egregious misuse of your authority. Now, people are going to want to say, but you can't not give them the bad stuff, because if you don't give kids, a bit of discipline, then they're never going to learn. If you don't scare them a bit, they're never going to learn bravery. But I'm saying, if you could just give them bravery without fear, that would be pretty cool. I think in some cases you can't do that. So I think bravery is conceptually reliant on fear. I don't think you can be brave if you're not scared. The question then becomes for situations like that, because, for example, is chemotherapy a good thing? Yes, because it cures or sometimes comes close to curing cancer. But it's not intrinsically a good thing. It's instrumentally a good thing, because you wouldn't have it just for its own sake, right? It's a horrible thing. It's like a really horrible thing to go through, but it brings this good result. In this case, it's at least conceivable that there could be a situation in which somebody doesn't have cancer and also doesn't need to go through chemotherapy. So in that case, if you gave them chemotherapy anyway, if you gave them cancer so that you could give them chemotherapy, you'd say, I understand that you think chemotherapy is good, but it's only good insofar as this bad thing exists. And I'd rather have neither of them. So some of them are more like the chemotherapy and some of them are more like bravery, and that they're literally conceptually related. And in the cases of ones that are like bravery, where you can't have bravery without fear, I think I'd probably just rather have neither. But in the case of instrumental goods, like you're describing, I think it would be gross to say how glad we could be that we have cancer, because without cancer we wouldn't have the good of chemotherapy. That is sort of what it rings. That's what rings through my ears when I hear people use this kind of theodicy. It sounds a bit like that, because it's very difficult to step outside of how the world actually in fact works. It's very difficult to shake off this idea that, no, yeah, I'm glad I had bad experiences because they made me who I am. It's like, if you could have been made who you are in the same way without going through the suffering, I think that would have been a preferable life. But I'm not saying that of you, I'm saying that in general.
But is that even possible though? I think of strength training, and I think of anything. Right. You grinding out your YouTube channel. You've been doing this longer than I have. You've been faithful to it. You've suffered to get to where you're at. You've been doing this since you were a teenager. Strength training, you're literally tearing apart muscles to rebuild better muscles, and then you got to get your diet and your nutrition locked in. All of life seems to be suffering, right? It's just, do we get to choose the suffering, or does the suffering choose us based on people sinning against us? And the end result is the same. My kids will have to go through some degree of suffering. Right now, suffering is I didn't get to watch today. Mommy and daddy didn't get me to watch today. I still was a thorn for the day. I didn't get to watch, right? But we all will have to go through various degrees of suffering, and that ultimately is for our good. Now, I get your cancer parallel. That's a strong argument in terms of chemo versus, creating chemo to fight the cancer. But gosh, could we just not have either? And I mean, again, there's probably people that have gone through that process, and we've lost people to cancer. We've lost young people to us who just tragically died, and we don't know why. When I was 19, my best friend died. He was 20 years old. I don't know why. I don't have those answers, but I do believe that that's the beautiful part about the Christian worldview, because I don't have to go beyond Jesus himself to make sense of suffering, because I follow a suffering servant, and it makes sense of the next life, the new heaven, the new earth, the hope that maybe one day it will all click and it will make sense, though I don't have the answers, and there's a mystery that I'm okay with living. There's a tension I'm okay with living in, versus just kind of saying, man, it's all chaos and just, it just sounds like a darker story,
So there are two approaches to this conversation. One is to say, I don't know why they're suffering, but I'm okay with that mystery as a Christian, and that's fine. But the other is, if you are having a discussion or a debate and we're talking about the problem of evil as an argument against the existence of God, that's where appealing to mystery doesn't work, like in that context, right? So to be clear, if you're a Christian, that's what I think faith is, by the way. Faith is not belief without evidence, it's belief without direct evidence. It's something like, the example that's often given is, how do you trust that your chair isn't going to fall apart? And you say, well, I have confidence that's going to happen because of all the other times that I've sat in the chair. So it's like you still have no direct evidence that like that chair isn't going to collapse, but you have a lot of other separate confirming evidence that makes you sort of, and that's what faith is. It's belief without evidence here, but you've got enough evidence in the background, right?
Yes.
So faith in God in this instance is like, in the background, you've got enough to know that he exists and that he's good. And so anywhere that you don't know, you have faith. That's not exactly blind because you've got that stuff in the background, but it's blind to those specific issues. That is fine. Like if somebody has a list of arguments for God's existence, like the contingency argument or something, and they think that this deductively demonstrates the existence of God. And if they also think that the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection makes that the most likely version or something, so they just believe that God exists and it's Christian God, then they could just say, well, I don't know why they're suffering, but I know that there's a good God who exists, so I know that there must be an explanation. Like, that's fine. It's called skeptical theism. Like, it's fine. Like that, there's nothing like wrong with that view. But of course, that doesn't do anything to actually counter the problem of evil. Like, if you want to talk about the problem of evil, then it's like, let's have an opinion on it, right? And I don't know is a legitimate opinion, but that just means that we're not having this conversation, right?
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, I know from my own life, based on my own experience, on how I process the problem of evil in very real suffering that I've gone through personally and that I've recently experienced. We recently had a loss in the family, and I know in my own life. However, I can't ascribe a working framework for everyone's suffering. So I'll say, why do people suffer on a grand scale?
Not everybody like interprets their suffering in the same way. I know a lot of people who've suffered who would rather have not gone through it.
That's fair. Yeah.
And maybe they just haven't discovered the reason yet. Maybe there is some reason. I think as a Christian, you kind of have to believe that there must be some kind of reason.
Yes.
But I think that bearing in mind that like you're talking to somebody who's not a Christian, so that background info isn't there, what I'm faced with is a lot of suffering. And by the way, like I said, I place less emphasis on the philosophy of religion these days, partly because I don't think you can ever actually establish anything. Like if we could have done, we would have done it already,
Do you have a solution? Do you have a solution for the problem solving in your worldview, or like the agnostic atheist, or does it not even matter? Like it's a non sequitur because you're not looking for a good God in your worldview.
Yeah, well, atheism, insofar as I'm an atheist, which is to say, I mean, I've always been more of an agnostic, but a lot of that's, well, not always, sorry. I mean, like, although in a way, because the online atheist community always used to sort of stress that atheism is just a lack of belief in God. And that became like a huge debate like 5-10 years ago. It was like a big thing. And so I think actually even at the time, like, when pressed, you'd say, well, I just don't believe that there is a God, which probably broadly puts you in the ballpark of agnosticism. But there are still arguments against God's existence, like the problem of evil. You might not
Sure.
think that they establish the falsity of theism, but they are positively atheist arguments. But atheism as a worldview, insofar as it is a worldview, doesn't really have much content. Certainly agnosticism does not. And so when people like to say, well, what does your worldview offer? It's like, nothing, but it's not supposed to, you know? Like Bill Maher once said that atheism is a religion in the way that abstinence is a sex position. And that's at least true of agnosticism. It's like, well, what kind of sexual thrill does abstinence give you? Well, none, but that's kind of the point.
Yeah. No, that's fair. Hey, thank you so much for checking out the video. Please be sure to comment below and subscribe and all that good stuff. And check out this other video that YouTube seems to be recommending just for you. Let me know if they nailed it. All right? I'll see you over there. Peace.